I was holding an old hand plane, thinking one thing: somebody let this thing go way too soon. "How much for the workbench?" I called out to the woman sitting in a folding chair by the garage door, counting change in a coffee can. $50, she said, without even looking up. "Everything on it comes with it." I stepped closer. The workbench sat in the back of the garage, under a layer of dust that hadn't built up overnight. The maple top, darkened with years of oil and use, held an old vise, a set of chisels, and a tangled extension cord. I ran my hand along the edge. The wood was solid, just slightly warped from moisture. "This isn't just a workbench," I said. "It's an Almia, German-made. They haven't made these in 20 years. The woman finally looked up, somewhere around 49, in a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar, hair pulled back into a loose knot, with a few gray strands escaping. "My husband used to say the same thing, only he called it helmet." "Why helmet?" "Because that bench was meaner than he was," she said, finally standing up, brushing off her jeans. "Creaked on every single move for years, and Stanley always said it just had character." I smiled, even though I didn't want to, not standing on someone else's driveway, in the middle of someone else's grief, laid out on a tarp for sale. "Linda," she said, offering her hand. "This was my husband's sale, or what's left of him in the garage anyway. Irving, carpenter. Well, retired carpenter, who still can't walk past a garage sale without digging through someone else's tools." I crouched down and pulled out one of the drawers. It stuck, groaning as it slid, and inside sat a row of chisels, sorted by size, each one carefully wrapped in an oiled rag. "He kept this in good order," I said. "Not a question, a fact. Stanley used to say tools are like teeth. Neglect them once, and after that it's just extraction." "Smart man." "He was," Linda said flatly, no strain in her voice, like she'd repeated that line 100 times already. 2 years ago. Heart." I nodded and didn't add anything. No, I'm sorry. No, I understand how hard that must be. I'd seen enough faces over the last 3 years to know people get tired of hearing sympathy faster than they get tired of not receiving it. I ran my hand over the tabletop again and found a small crack near the clamp. "That crack there, an hour's work easy. But this," I pointed to the loose vise mechanism, "this is worse. Somebody put in the wrong screw and stripped the threads." "Stanley was never much good at fixing the things he actually used." Linda crossed her arms, watching me talk to her dead husband's workbench like it was an old friend. Ironic, right? A carpenter who hated repairing his own tools. Not ironic, ordinary. I'm the same way. She let out a short laugh, the first one of the conversation. Not quite a laugh, something halfway between grief and relief. "So, you taking it? $50 and helmet's yours." I straightened up, wiped my palms on my jeans. "No." "No? A bench like this doesn't deserve to end up in somebody's attic or basement gathering dust for the rest of its life. Let me take it, fix it up, and bring it back once it's working the way it should." Linda narrowed her eyes, like she was trying to spot the catch. "That doesn't make any sense. I'm selling it. Why would you waste your time bringing back the thing I'm trying to get rid of?" "Because in a week you're going to look at that empty corner of the garage and realize you didn't just get rid of furniture," I said, quieter now, more careful than I meant to be. "And in a year, somebody's going to sell that Almia for $20 at a flea market to someone who has no idea what it even is." She stayed quieter longer than the moment called for. "You always this pushy with people who've got nails in their pockets?" she finally asked, and something like a smile flickered in her voice. "Only when I see something worth saving." Linda looked at the bench, then at me, then back at the bench, like she was weighing something heavier than just letting a piece of furniture leave her garage. "Fine," she said at last, "but on one condition." What's that? When you bring it back, you tell me exactly what was wrong with it. Because honestly, she waved a hand at the tools spread across the tarp, for the last 2 years I've been selling things I know nothing about, and that's starting to bother me more than it should. I looked at her a little longer than I meant to, and it hit me. The repair job anybody else could knock out in one evening was going to take me a lot longer than that. "Deal," I said, and 20 minutes later, as I was loading the Olmia into the bed of my truck, Linda stood in the driveway watching me go. She'd admit later that it was right then she thought, for the first time in 2 years, a stranger hadn't told her, "I'm sorry." He'd just taken a piece of her husband with him and promised to bring it back alive. I didn't touch the workbench at all the first week. I set the Olmia up in the corner of my shop, walked around it 3 times like a doctor examining a patient before surgery, and decided I needed to figure out exactly what I was dealing with first. The loose vise, I could have had that fixed in half a day. Instead, I called Linda. "Hello? It's Irving, the workbench guy." "I remember who you are." A smile crept into her voice. "Something wrong?" "Question. There's a maker's stamp on the vise, but the numbers are worn off. You don't happen to remember when Stanley bought it? Even just a rough year?" The pause on the other end lasted longer than the question warranted. "98, I think. Or 99. We'd just moved into this house, and he said a shop without a real workbench was just a garage, not a shop. Makes sense." "Irving," she hesitated, "are you seriously calling me about a model year?" "No," I admitted honestly, but it was the only excuse I could come up with in the time it took the phone to ring. She laughed, short, surprised, like she hadn't expected that reaction from herself. The following week, I drove over in person, with a much sturdier excuse. I brought the old vice screw I'd taken out and asked if there might be any spare parts for the bench lying around the garage, since people sometimes keep that kind of thing separately. Linda led me into the garage, which now stood half empty. The sale had cleared out a good chunk of the tools, and the bare walls seemed oddly exposed to me. "His hardware shelf used to be right here." Linda opened an old dresser, digging through little boxes of screws and washers. "He labeled everything. Look." Each box had a slip of paper taped to it, written in careful handwriting. "Screws, Olmia parts, do not touch. Misc, sort someday." "Sort someday," I read out loud. "How old is this box?" 10 years, maybe? He always said someday, and then there was no time left at all. She said it plainly, no strain in her voice, and kept counting screws into a little bag like nothing important had just been said. I didn't rush to answer. I just took the bag from her hands, turned one of the screws over in my fingers, checking the threads against my broken sample. "That's the one," I finally said. "Thanks." "That's it? That's what you drove halfway across town for?" "No," I said again, and this time I didn't bother inventing a reason. We ended up standing in that garage for another hour, me looking over old blueprints pinned to the wall with yellowed thumbtacks, Linda telling me how Stanley spent months building a crib for a grandson he never got to see grow up because the baby was born 2 weeks before the heart attack. "I've never told anyone that before," she said suddenly, sounding surprised at her own words. "Not because it's a secret, it's just people get uncomfortable. They nod, say, 'Yeah, that's hard,' and change the subject. And here you are asking about the angle on the headboard." "Because I actually want to know the angle on the headboard," I said honestly. "And I want to know what he was like when he wasn't building things." "Stubborn," she smiled, looking out the garage window like she was seeing something nobody else could. Impossibly stubborn, and funny when he wasn't trying to be serious. I listened, nodded in the right places, and thought about how a bench repair meant to take 1 evening had now stretched into 2 weeks, and I hadn't even started sanding the tabletop. When I got ready to leave, Linda suddenly stopped me by the garage door. "Irving, be honest with me about one thing." "Go ahead." How long does fixing a vise actually take? I froze with my hand on the truck door, searching for the right words, while she stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like she already knew the answer and was just waiting to see if I'd have the nerve to say it out loud. 3 days, I finally said. Honest answer, 3 days, tops, if nothing distracts me. Linda stayed quiet, and I could tell she was putting it all together in her head. Every phone call about the model year, every trip out here for screws that were sitting 5 minutes from my own house the whole time. It's been 3 weeks, Irving. Yeah. And every single time you showed up with some excuse. Yeah. She crossed her arms tighter, but the corner of her mouth twitched up. That same little motion I'd already learned to recognize as her way of holding back a smile she wasn't ready to admit had already won. You could have just said it straight. Said what? The bench has been done for 2 weeks and I've just been looking for reasons to keep showing up? I scratched the back of my neck. You could have said thanks, goodbye, and that would have been that. This way, I had 3 weeks to let you get used to seeing me on your driveway. Linda looked at me for a long moment, and I already regretted saying it that plainly out loud. And you actually thought I'd say goodbye? Didn't know for sure, that's why I didn't ask. She didn't say anything else, just nodded toward the truck, like, go on then, carpenter, go bring me my workbench, the one that, from the sound of it, had been ready for a while now. It's been ready since last Friday, I admitted. Excuse me? I fixed the vise 2 weeks ago, sanded the tabletop in 3 days, just like I said I would. I spent the rest of the time coming up with reasons to drive back out here. Linda covered her face with her hand, but the laugh slipped out through her fingers anyway. So the screws, the model year, the spare parts in the dresser, all stuff I already had memorized by the second phone call. You are the worst liar I have ever met. The worst liar who held your workbench hostage for 3 weeks. Fair enough. I brought the Omia back the very next morning. The vise moved smooth, no creak at all, the new screw threads sitting in like they'd always belonged there. Everything I could have shown her 2 weeks earlier if I hadn't been afraid the excuse would run out right along with the repair. We carried the bench into the garage together. I took the heavier end, she gave directions on where to put it, with the confidence of someone who'd been running the show for 20 years. Perfect, she said, circling the bench the same way I'd circled it 3 weeks before. Helmet's home. He doesn't creak anymore, by the way. Try the vise. She squeezed the handle, quiet, smooth, not a hint of that signature creak she'd described the very first day. For a second, something crossed her face that was hard to name in one word. Not sadness, not happiness, but that space in between where people live once they've lost someone and are slowly learning how to keep going. You know what I decided while I was waiting? She asked, not looking at me, running her fingers over the smooth tabletop. What? I signed up for a woodworking class. They run it Saturdays at the community center on Maple Street. I called about it back in week 2 of your random phone calls. I looked at her, then at the empty corner of the garage where boxes of someone else's tools used to sit. Now there was enough space for a chair, a shelf for materials, a lamp over the work area. You're going to need a second bench, something smaller for the finer work. This one's too much for a beginner. Are you already planning out my garage? I'm planning my next excuse to come back. She laughed. Not the short, surprised laugh from the phone call, but a full, real laugh, the kind people give when they haven't done it in a while and forgot what it felt like. We spent another hour moving shelves around, measuring space for the second bench, arguing over whether she needed a separate cabinet for her tools or if Spanley's old dresser would do. She held firm on the dresser. I lost that argument without a single regret. When the last shelf was finally screwed into place, Linda wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at me like she'd just made up her mind about something. Come inside. I wasn't expecting company today, but I baked a pie this morning. Just felt like it. Seems a shame to let it go to waste. What kind of pie? Apple, with cinnamon. Stanley always said I put in too much cinnamon. Sounds like I'm in luck then. Her kitchen turned out to be small, with yellow curtains and a clock running 7 minutes slow. She cut into the still warm pie, poured coffee without asking if I wanted any, just set the cup down in front of me, like someone used to deciding for two. "Cinnamon's just right," I said, mouth full. "See, Stanley never did understand good baking." We sat at that table longer than any pie on earth could really justify. She told me about learning to bake from her mother. I told her about my old boss chewing me out over crooked joints on my first stools, and neither one of us ever glanced at that clock running 7 minutes slow. A few months have passed since that day. Now every Saturday morning the light's on in that garage on the corner of Oak Street, and you can hear a hand router buzzing low or sandpaper scraping against fresh wood somewhere inside. Linda says the first shelf came out crooked, the second one turned out a little better, and the cabinet doors she's working on now, she's actually ready to show off. These days I'm a regular in that shop. Not with excuses about screws or spare parts, just because there's always work for two hands in the evenings and coffee that never quite gets the chance to go cold. Sometimes we just close up the garage early and head to the cafe on the corner, where the waitress already asks, "The usual?" without waiting for an answer. On Sundays, we walk the park by the river, and Linda always manages to spot some tree and tell me exactly what kind of shelf it would make. Helmut stands in the corner of the garage, quiet now, no creak left in him, and he's the only one of the three of us still pretending he doesn't care who keeps showing up every Saturday.